This year on Press the Button, we covered the war in Ukraine from the beginning and all of its implication on nuclear policy.
For those following the news, this is Ukraine Crisis Week. The United States and Russian diplomats are meeting in Geneva to try to talk their way out of another Russian invasion of Ukraine, where Russia has about 100,000 troops on the border.
This is as dangerous a situation as the Cuban Missile Crisis was, or perhaps more dangerous than the crisis in 1962. We are facing possible actual war with Russia. This demands, in my mind, a political and diplomatic resolution.
The chaos benefits Putin. As long as Ukraine is too destable to join NATO or the European Union, Russia wins in this situation because Ukraine has to still remain within its sphere of influence. And I think that's the key goal here for Putin. It's not to rebuild the Soviet Union, but it is to maintain Russia's sphere of influence, both politically and economically.
The other very important element of this, the Russian signal to the West, is one seeking to convey, do not interfere militarily in the crisis or in the operation in Ukraine. That would have potentially very dire consequences.
But if he goes nuclear, then all bets are off. And the war aims of the United States, I think, do change, because I don't see how we stand by with a Russian leader using nuclear weapons anyway. I just don't think that's a tenable situation for the world.
Instead of saying, if Ukraine had kept that nuclear capability, would Russia have invaded? Instead, the question is, what would have happened to Ukraine if it insisted on keeping Soviet nuclear weapons?
I'm fairly optimistic that the war in Ukraine, which indeed has been going on for almost 8 years now, is not going to motivate new countries to reconsider their past non-proliferation choices and to go about the bomb.
Putin himself seems to be taking a reasonably mellow approach to the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So I don't really see this as a moment in which we need to worry that the Russians are going to preemptively attack Finland or Sweden so that they can get at them before they have a NATO security guarantee.
So this is all about coercive diplomacy in terms of his already rhetorical deployment of nuclear weapons, and then it may of course move into the actual kinetic act of coercion. And we should never think that Putin isn't contemplating this.
We covered more on nuclear risk, the prospect of arms control, and the 2022 Nuclear Posture Review.
The big takeaway here is that we can't expect that nuclear deterrence will always function exactly as how we predict. And doing so risks overconfidence in our own ability to control escalation.
Earlier this year until where we are now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, using Russia's nuclear arsenal as a shield to commit violence and to invade a country. I think that really changed the calculus of how the Biden administration saw its NPR.
It's a very bizarre situation to have a president essentially claiming they have these powers to declassify at will. Usually when it's presidents in secrecy, it's the other problem. It's the president saying, I have the power to make certain things secret at will, not I have the power to make things not secret at will, and to make them not secret secretly, which again, very bizarre construction.
Should we fail to replace New START, we would, for the first time since 1972, live in a world without limits on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. I personally don't want to live in that kind of world.
And we gave space to the important conversations of intersections in the nuclear field.
And so the more that we center the people at our core of this work, and we see people as equitable, as authentic, and as holistic beings, the more beautiful this movement gets, the more powerful this movement gets, the more people want to latch on to this movement.
I think this document really sets up Congress and the administration to spend a lot more money on anything that can be labeled essential to security. And I think it will encourage policymakers to reattach the U.S. to a more militarized spending, more nuclear weapons modernization. And that's purely because of the size of the military ambition that is outlined in this document.
So for all of these communities, RICA is a very valuable program for those who are eligible. It's always had really strong bipartisan support, and it's a really important recognition of the harm caused by our government's nuclear activities.
There's an expectation either that our communities speak on the issues that affect us when we're presenting trauma for a white audience, or alternatively, when we're serving as like a token to be villainized or to be praised. There was not a lot of opportunities for speakers, especially everyday people, to just talk about their lives and their experiences and how political spaces impact us in unique and individual and nuanced ways.
Nuclear war would be horrible for the whole world, and the only way to prevent it is to get rid of the nuclear weapons, because if they exist, they can be used.
Actually building real relationships with people and really trying to build a strong and fruitful movement. That can be very daunting, and it is a lot of work. It's not something that can happen within, a certain amount of time frame. It's something that's going to be ongoing, and we just have to remind ourselves that this is something we have to actively work towards every day.
And I also want to say that I think the level of solidarity we're seeing and the outpouring of support is because the images and videos coming out from Iran are so remarkable. When you see women standing on top of police cars, when you see them tying up their hair, getting ready to confront armed guards, it is impossible not to be moved to want to do everything in your power to support them.
And I think a lot has to do with how do we value life and when do we value life? And the answer is inconsistently. And for those in power who are making decisions, it's really for whenever it suits them and whatever aims and goals they'd like to accomplish.
And with that, we look forward to bringing you more coverage on nuclear and national security issues next year.
Welcome to Press the Button's 2022 year-end wrap-up, where we look back at the stories we covered this year and look ahead to 2023. You just heard some of the great guests we had on the podcast, and what a year it has been. Today I'm joined by my co-host Lauren Billet. Hey Lauren, how are you?
Hi Tom, I'm great. I hope that you're doing well. I know it's the end of the year, you're getting ready to travel, lots to look forward to. So it's really fun to be able to take a look back on all that we did this year. So I hope that our listeners enjoyed the highlight reel that was played, which our amazing producers put together to remind everyone of the informative and moving interviews that we aired this year. I believe it's a nice demonstration of the depth of this show. So thanks to each and every one of our guests for helping us cover these important topics. And thanks again to our producers for the work that they put into creating this show.
And of course, 2022 was a busy year on the nuclear front. I actually went back to our last year's year-end review to kind of help prepare for the show and get a sense of where we were a year ago. And, we started out 2022 with so many great possibilities, a lot of which unfortunately ended in disappointment. But what a year it's been. To me, the biggest surprise of the year, and I'm sure to everyone else as well, was Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, President Putin's nuclear threats that came out of that, and the increased attention that has been paid to nuclear weapons in the press and everywhere during the year. Just quite remarkable. We also had the Biden administration's disappointing nuclear posture review, which itself was delayed by the Ukraine war. And then we had the administration needing to unite the allies to support Ukraine. Unfortunately, that led President Biden to feel that he could not pursue some of the more progressive nuclear policies that this community and others were asking for, such as no first use and a sole purpose declaration. We also came close on the Iran nuclear deal, only to see the talks stall and then get overtaken by the protest movement in Iran and the reported drone sales to Russia. China's nuclear arsenal expansion continues, as do tensions over Taiwan. We had Trump's bizarre attempt to hide nuclear documents at Mar-a-Lago, and that weird story continues. North Korea is testing missiles by the dozen, and we almost had resumed talks on New START, although they were unfortunately called off at the last minute, and we'll have more of that in a bit. But it's been a busy year.
It has been a busy year indeed. So, Tom, out of all of those topics, which ones do you think are you taking away with you this year?
Well, for better or worse, I think Ukraine was the story of the year. In the wake of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, nuclear tensions went up to a level we have not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had Putin's repeated nuclear threats, which were intended on his part to keep the United States and NATO from directly engaging in the war. We had the crisis at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, very scary situation, and how the International Atomic Energy Agency Director General Rafael Grossi bravely led his team in there in August and early September to establish some international presence there. We saw NATO seeking to expand to Finland and Sweden with their decisions to join. And, I think it's interesting to take a moment and look at the role of nuclear weapons and how they're factoring into this crisis. Because, as we all know, the United States is doing a lot to help Ukraine, and rightly so. Billions of dollars in military aid, in humanitarian aid, in aid to rebuild the energy infrastructure there. But there's a lot we're not doing, right? We're not sending troops. We're not supporting a no-fly zone. We're not sending to Ukraine longer-range weapons that could reach into Russia. And again, we're doing that for good reason. We don't want to give Russia an excuse to escalate the war and use nuclear weapons. And so the fact that Russia has nuclear weapons that it's bringing to bear to this crisis is serving to limit U.S. military support. So much so, I think it's fair to say that Ukraine could have won the war by now if we did not need to worry about Russia going nuclear. And we need to face the fact that nuclear weapons are prolonging this crisis and ask whose interests are they serving? And I think the answer is not ours. In Ukraine, nuclear weapons are benefiting Russia and undermining U.S. and European security. And a key lesson here to me is that the West would be much better off in Ukraine if no one had the bomb. Shifting to the Iran nuclear deal, as we mentioned, the Biden administration came close this past summer to getting a deal, but the regime in Iran was apparently not ready to take it, so things dragged into the fall, and then we got the explosion of the protest movement over civil rights, and then news that Iran was selling drones to Russia. So the prospects of getting back into the deal at this point have greatly dimmed, and probably right now it would be a hard sell to pass the deal in Congress, even if we could get it. So prospects not looking good. But even so, we need to support the deal as the best way to stop an Iranian nuclear bomb. This may not be the best time for diplomacy with Iran, but the deal is still worthwhile. So if we can't get the deal, we need other diplomatic approaches, such as, for example, a freeze on Iran's nuclear program and greater transparency into what they are doing. Because ultimately, diplomacy is the way forward, and there's no military solution to this situation. Finally, just a few words on the New START treaty. As we all recall, the United States and Russia extended New START for 5 years soon after the Biden administration came into office, and amazingly, that was almost 2 years ago. So the treaty expires in about 3 years and can't be extended again. And if we lose this, we'll have no limits on U.S. and Russian nuclear forces for the first time in 50 years. So, 3 years may sound like a lot to save the treaty, but it's really not much time when you realize how challenging the task is. And let's just look at that for a minute. The politics are really tough internationally, with the U.S. and Russia relations being in the basement. And in fact, Russia used the Ukraine crisis as the reason why it delayed the talks on New START just a few weeks ago. On the policy front, even here in the United States, there'll be a fight about the terms of the treaty. Because even here, some are starting to argue that we need more nuclear weapons, not less. And so there's going to be a political fight on what the terms of the treaty should be. And then we have President Putin himself, right after the Russian military's dismal performance in Ukraine. Putin may want to hold on to his nukes tighter than ever. And so it may make it just more difficult for him to agree to a deal. But even so, the Biden administration must find a way to bring more pressure on Russia to talk about New START. We just don't have the time to waste another year. And we need to realize that New START is the first step towards reducing Russia's arsenal and the first step towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. So we must take this door. There's no way around it. But Lauren, how about you? What are some of your takeaways from the year?
Thanks, Tom. The stories that I am taking away from this year are those related to citizens' struggles with their governments, specifically struggles related to self-autonomy, which we saw in Iran, as you mentioned, Tom. the United States, China, and maybe didn't witness but are aware of in other regions of the world. The relationship between citizen and government is one that I have always found fascinating. You cannot deny its direct connection to the entirety of politics and policy, including, of course, nuclear policy. But Tom, and going back to our podcast and our episodes from this year, which ones stand out to you the most?
Well, thanks. It was just a great year of interviews, and there are so many to pick from. And I certainly hope that the ones that I don't pick, that no one takes offense. They did get mentioned. But there's only time to pick a few. So a few that stick out to me are, we had Kimberly St. Julian Varnon. She's a PhD student in history at University of Pennsylvania, who we had twice on the podcast, and she provided excellent context on what's happening in Ukraine, particularly at the beginning of the war and how we got to that point. And she also touched on a misperception shared by many. At that point, many people were thinking this was a new conflict because they were just coming into it. But of course, the Ukraine conflict has been going on for years. And so Kimberly really helped us understand the origins of what's going on. We had some great interviews with Alex Wellerstein, a nuclear historian and associate professor of science and technology at the Stevens Institute of Technology. We had him on twice, first to discuss initial reports that former President Trump took nuclear documents to Mar-a-Lago, and then to discuss the weird New York City nuclear public service announcement about, how to survive nuclear war. And he really provided a lot of understanding to us about what restricted data is and why nuclear weapon secrets are treated in a different way from other national security secrets. We also had Cindy Vestergaard, a senior fellow and director of the Nuclear Safeguards Program at the Stimson Center. We had her on to talk about the IAEA visit to Zaporizhia in Ukraine after months of negotiations to get an international presence at the plant. And she gave us a deeper understanding of why there's so much concern surrounding Zaporizhia and what we need to do to reduce the risk. We had Hans Christensen, director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. He sat down with us to break down the misperceptions surrounding so-called tactical nuclear weapons and how these shorter-range battlefield weapons, as they're more appropriately called, are not necessarily low yield at all and in fact can be quite large. And finally, my summary list includes Jessica Slate and John Wolfstall, both at Global Zero. They helped us break down the long-awaited Biden administration's nuclear posture review that was released in October after being delayed by the Ukraine war. And they discussed the takeaways from the NPR, whether the NPR responded to the nuclear dangers we're now facing in Ukraine, and whether President Biden delivered on the promises he made as a candidate. And spoiler alert, no, he did not. But Lauren, what episodes stood out to you this year?
Thanks, Tom. And all of those were fantastic interviews, as were all of our interviews. Like you said, I hope that those that don't make this list are not offended. We appreciate everyone equally. We just have limited time in this episode. So for me, we were able to highlight a lot of new voices on the podcast this year. And I have to say that I have a major soft spot for interviews that highlight the intersections between nuclear policy and other movements. For example, reproductive rights and climate change. So the interviews that stick out to me from this year are about those intersections, including the interview that I conducted with Yasmin Silva after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade this summer. Yasmin is an organizer, activist, and the national field manager at Population Connection. I had the opportunity back in July to have a conversation with her about the intersection between nuclear policy, national security, and other issues, including reproductive rights. But she also provided an understanding of how reproductive rights and nuclear weapons are connected and why it's important for people to be aware of the intersections that exist between nuclear policy and other issues. Turning to the intersection between nuclear policy and climate change now, we had the opportunity to have 2 early warnings that featured guests who are scientists who have conducted studies relating to nuclear weapons' impact on the climate. The first was Dr. Cheryl Harrison of LSU, who led a team of researchers as they studied computer simulations of the impact of regional and larger nuclear warfare on the Earth's systems, especially its oceans. And the second was with Rutgers University's Dr. Alan Robach, who co-led a study with Dr. Lily Shaw, which found that even a, quote, limited nuclear conflict would lead to mass starvation and death of an estimated 2.5 billion people, which is terrifying, but that's why we do what we do here at Plowshares Fund. So Tom, taking a moment to look forward to next year, what do you think that we can expect in 2023?
Thanks, Lauren. Well, predictions are always dangerous, but I'll make a few. This was the first year of war in Ukraine, and I really can't see any end to it in sight. And unfortunately, I think the war will drag on and the nuclear threats from President Putin will continue. And, we all want Ukraine to win, but we will have to continue to worry about what President Putin will do if he faces defeat. Would he go nuclear? This will prolong the war and make the end game very tricky. On China, I would expect Beijing to continue to expand its nuclear forces as it tries to catch up essentially with the United States. I see this as more defensive than offensive, but of course that's debatable and ultimately who knows. But this is already leading to calls to expand the U.S. nuclear arsenal so we can have as many as Russia and China combined. I think as our listeners know, this doesn't really make any sense. This is not really a numbers game. It's about capability, and we can deter an attack from Russia and China regardless of how many weapons they have. So the thought of us needing as many as Russia and China combined really makes no sense. On the Iran nuclear deal, as we discussed, even though it may be politically awkward, at some point the Biden administration needs to restart talks with Iran. If they can talk to Russia, as hard as that is, they can talk to Iran. And bottom line is we need to keep diplomacy alive. Lastly, on New START, we need to get the treaty inspections back on track, and we need to talk with Russia about replacing this agreement. There's no way around this. To me, this is the most important thing we must do on nuclear security in 2023, and quite literally, the future of arms control is at stake. So, lots of challenges for 2023 and lots of opportunities for progress. And Lauren, what are you looking for next year?
I think next year, I'm really looking forward to continuing to highlight a range of voices on the podcast by focusing on the importance of giving space to discuss shared intersections, breaking down misinformation and misunderstandings surrounding nuclear weapons, and continuing overall to bring you, the listener, the breaking nuclear issues each week.
Hear, hear. I support that completely. And we would like to thank our wonderful guests and listeners for staying with us each week. Special thanks to my co-hosts Lauren Billet and Emma Belcher, and to the rest of the fantastic Press the Button team, Alex Hall, Angela Kellett, Charles Crosby, and Jacqueline Shing. And thank you all, and we will be back next year.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.